Genesis 5, 1 through 17. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them, and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died.
As we jump into Genesis chapter 5 this morning, let's start at the beginning. Start at verse 1. It says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Or as we looked at that word a few weeks ago when we ran across it in Genesis chapter 2, this is the Toledoth. That's the Hebrew word. The book of the generations, the account of the birth record of Adam. And so we know that this is an important point in the story. That's what we said when we run into that phrase. This is how the book is divided up. And so we know when we run into that phrase, this is the book of the generations of so-and-so. We know that we've kind of hit a turning point in the story. This is where the author's saying, okay, we've gotten this far. Now we're going to kind of change gears and flip over to a new chapter and look at something from maybe a slightly different perspective in the book. And so we see that here in verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. And then he goes back, and it's kind of interesting. He goes back and he just kind of rehashes creation for us just for a minute, just to remind us. And we see here he's actually using a lot of the same words that he's using at the end of Genesis chapter 1, where it describes the creation of humanity. It says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. And he blessed them and named them man when they were created. And so we have this kind of going back to creation, reminding us of what God has done here in creating Adam and creating humanity after his own image and after his own likeness. And then we see something interesting here in verse 3. It says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his own image. And so we see that image being passed down. We have God creating Adam in his image and in his likeness. Now we know that Adam didn't stay completely. There's kind of two sides to the nature of Adam. On one hand, he's created in the image and the likeness of God. On the other hand, he's tarnished that image. He's covered it over with his sin. So we have this kind of broken, tarnished image of God. It's still there, but it's kind of cloaked by kind of like Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, right? He's still Emperor Palpatine when he's got the hood on, right? But he's kind of cloaked with the if you're not a Star Wars fan, that's okay. Nobody's perfect, but you know what I'm getting at. We all know of a character like that in maybe like the Wizard of Oz. He's kind of behind the curtain. He's still there, but he's behind the curtain. And that's what we have with Adam here. We have Adam created in the image of God, and that image is tarnished, is kind of broken in some way. And so we have in Adam this spark of God's image, and then this kind of sin nature that he has entered to through his rebellion against God. And so as we continue on in verse 3, he fathers a son in his own likeness, after his own image. And so that image of God is passed down from Adam, through Adam, to Seth. Now the sin nature, that's not the only thing he passed down. He also passes down the sin nature as well. But the image of God. Adam is created in the image of God. Seth is created in the image of Adam, in the image of God. And it's interesting that we don't read this when we're talking about Cain in Genesis chapter 4. We don't see that Cain was fathered in Adam's own image and his own likeness. Now, I don't think that's because the image of God was not in Cain. I think Cain was created in the image of God just as much as Seth, just as much as any of us are. But the author here, Moses, camps out on that for a moment in verse 3 here to kind of drive that point home. Seth is created in the image of God. That image of God that was given to Adam is passed down to us and passed down through us. Right? He makes a point of that with Seth. And I think this is important for us. And in the time of the apostles, this was actually very, very important. This idea was very, very important for the apostles. Because Cain, although he is Adam's son, and although he was made in Adam's likeness and in Adam's image, just like Seth was, what we see is we have two very different lineages. And in a sense, not all of Adam's children are Adam's children. Does that make sense? Not all of Adam's children who are physically his children are spiritually the son of Adam, the son of God. Not all of these people that God created are actually God's people in a spiritual sense. And that's going to become very important for the apostles as they write the New Testament. The apostle Paul said that about Israel, about Abraham's grandson Jacob. Said not all Israel are Israel. And see, that seems a little strange at first, right? Not all Israel are Israel. Well, you just said they're Israel, but then you said they're not Israel. And what he's saying is, not all physical descendants of Abraham are spiritually Abraham's children. Not all physical people of God who can trace all of us can trace our lineage back to God are spiritually God's people, right? Not all children of Abraham are children of Abraham. Not all Israel are spiritually God's people. Only those who are spiritually descended from him through Jesus. Only those of us that have placed our faith in Jesus, only then are we truly God's people. And for us today, the same thing is true. Not all Southerners are Christian. Did you know that? Right? Not all Americans are Christians. Not all people who find their way into a church on Sunday morning are Christians. Not all Republicans are Christians. You might be able to trace your physical lineage back through all kinds of godly people. You may have a heritage that includes pastors and missionaries and saints and all kinds of godly people, but that does not necessarily make you spiritually one of God's people. Just ask Cain. Cain was the son of Adam, who, according to Luke, was the son of God. But Cain wasn't a son of God in that sense. He wasn't the son of promise. He was a child of destruction. But in Seth, what we have here in Genesis chapter 5 is the story of the true children of Adam. These are the story of the sons of God. We've dealt with the story of the children of Cain. Now we're dealing with the story of the true sons of Adam, the sons of God. So that's one thing that we need to understand here about Genesis chapter 5. Another thing that we need to understand when we look at this account of the children of Adam is something that we've already kind of touched on a little bit. But they're created after his own likeness. Again, verse 3, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. And it doesn't say that about Cain. And like I said, I don't think it's because Cain wasn't created in the image of God. I think the image of God was passed down to Cain. But Moses is emphasizing that in Seth and in his descendants. The image gets passed down. This is the lineage of God. These are the people of God. These are the true sons of Adam. This is, in a sense, they wouldn't have used this word back then, but this, in a sense, this is the true church, right? And that's an important distinction for us. Like I said, in our day and age, not everybody who wanders into a church is necessarily part of the church. But to be part of the church, we have to be part of the church through faith in Jesus. Right? And the image here gets passed down. It gets passed down to Seth, and it gets passed down through Seth to his son Enosh, and then it gets passed down through Enosh to Kenan, and then you have Jared, then you have Mahalalel. So Mahalalel is created in the image of God. Right? And there's a lot of implications for us today. We are made on some level in the image of God. We have that image still in us. We can trace that back to Adam. Right? And Cain, I believe he had that too. So all of us, whether or not we have come to Christ and whether or not we are true children of God through faith in Jesus, we have the image of God in us. We still have that divine spark in us, yet we also have that sin nature in us as well. We have these two sides warring against each other. But it has a lot of implications for us today because we are made on some level in the image of God. And that means that human life is worth protecting. That means that there is value and dignity and respect that human life deserves. That fetus growing inside the pregnant woman, it's not just a mass of tissue. It's a mass of human tissue that God is forming and creating and making after His own image. And it is worth protecting. It has value and dignity and worth. That's the kind of thing that plays well in conservative evangelical circles. But that homeless guy under the bridge that we drive over every day without even thinking about it, he is created in the image of God too. And he has value, and he has worth, and he has dignity. As horrific as what happened in San Antonio was several weeks ago, that guy that walked into that church and took the lives of 27, I think it was, images of God, he was created in the image of God too. Now he kind of went the other direction. He focused more on the sin nature that is his as well. But he was created in the image of God. That doesn't make what he did okay, because he took the lives of 27 other people who were created in the image of God. And that's a very serious crime. He killed the image of God 27 times. It's a big deal. That transgendered individual. I'm not saying I agree with what he's doing. I'm saying that they're created in the image of God. They're worthy of basic dignity and respect. They were created in the image of God. That's actually one of the problems that I have with it. I wish that people could learn to be content with who God created them to be, not trying to cover that up and try to make themselves into something that they wish they were created to be. And that goes for all of us. In a sense, if that's where the sin lies, then in a lot of cases, church people are guilty of the very same sin as transgendered individuals are guilty of. How many church people, they don't want to show the world who they really are. They want to show the world who they wish they were. That's why we dress up all nice and we put on a fake smile and we put on a fake life sometimes when we come to church. The old, you're driving in the car to church, you kids be quiet back there, da, 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 all kinds of craziness going on. They open the car door, close it behind you, see somebody with Deacon Jim in the parking lot. Oh, good morning, brother. This is the day that the Lord has made, isn't it? Now you're putting on a costume. You're putting on a Christian costume. We need to learn to be content with who God has created us to be. That doesn't mean that we flaunt our brokenness all over Facebook like other people sometimes do. But that also doesn't mean that we don't show people the people that we wish we were. We don't come to God as the people that we wish we were. We come to God as the people that He has made us to be. When I was younger, when I was growing up, I always liked the girl with the dark hair, no makeup, maybe baggy clothes, the sweatshirt. I mean, it was the 90s, so that was kind of cool back then. But still, I always kind of liked that because I don't want to see who you wish you were. I don't want to know the person that you wish you were. I want to see who you are. And I think the same thing goes for us in the Christian life. God doesn't want to see the people that we wish we were because He knows who we are. I am not a rock star. I have learned over the past 20 years to be okay with that. I know that might come as a surprise to you, but I'm not a rock star. Caitlyn Jenner is not a girl. And I wish he could learn to be okay with who he is. Either way, that's the point here. Either the way, living that lifestyle, leaving the LGBTQ lifestyle may be a sin. It is a sin. But it's also a sin to be a hateful jerk. Because we're dealing with the image of God. And honestly, being a hateful jerk is probably more destructive to more people. So don't be a hateful jerk. That's point number 2. Don't be a hateful jerk. To anyone. This is something we have to remember. We need to try to remember this, and it's so hard to remember this sometimes, but I need to try to remember that in every interaction that I have with somebody else, I need to try to remember that I'm dealing with the image of God here. And so I probably ought to watch my words. That's something maybe some of us need to write down this morning. In every interaction I have with someone else, I need to remember that I'm speaking with the image of God. And I probably ought to watch my words. And I think our words sometimes have a lot more power than we realize they do. And I think about how many times we've maybe saved somebody with our words without even realizing it. Or how many times we've done harm to somebody with our words without even realizing it. There's a song by a band called The Maine, and the song's called 24 Floors, and it's about a guy in the 24th floor of a hotel room trying to figure out if he wants to jump out the window or not. And if you go to their YouTube page, you'll see comment after comment, this song saved my life. I was in a dark place where this song was the only thing that I could hear. This is the only thing that could reach me. And I think these guys are not a Christian band, by any stretch of the imagination if you listen to some of their other songs. But to think, the power of words, that their words of the song, how cool would it be to write a song that literally saves somebody's life, And our words have more power than we realize sometimes. And in every interaction that we have with somebody, we are speaking with the image of God, and we need to keep that in mind. We need to remember that. So there's one more thing about the account of Adam that we need to look at before we close this morning. And it goes right along with what we've already talked about this morning. And that's, we don't know much about these guys. Kind of already talked about this just for a second, but we don't know a whole lot about these guys. We don't know a whole lot about Jared. We don't know a whole lot about Enosh and Kenan. We know a few things. We know they lived a long, long time, apparently. We know that they died. And in fact, it's interesting, the text goes to great lengths to point that out to us. Adam fathers Seth, and all the days of Adam, after he fathered Seth, were 800 years. He had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Well, it's not really necessary that kind of goes with, if Adam lived 930 years, that means he didn't live 931, and something happened between 930 and 930. He had to have died. You don't need to say that. But in every one, it says he lived this long, and then he died. Just kind of driving that point home toward us, that all these people died. And next week, we're going to meet a guy named Enoch toward the end of Genesis chapter 5, who his story ends a little bit differently. But he goes to great lengths kind of to bring that point out. They lived, they died. We find out in the second half of chapter 5, we find out what Noah's name means. We get to know a little bit about Enoch, but even he only gets a couple of verses. We don't know much. We know they lived. We know they died. To be crass, we know they had sex because they had children. They fulfilled, and that's not just me being crass. That's actually, they fulfilled God's first commandment to humanity. They were fruitful and they multiplied. They did what God commanded them to do. They obeyed the first commandment given at creation. But other than that, we don't know a whole lot about them. That doesn't mean there isn't anything to know. It just means, for whatever reason, we weren't given that information. That information wasn't preserved for us. Martin Luther said, and he's speculating here, but I think he's onto something. Martin Luther wrote this. He said, "We must not think that these are ordinary names of plain people. But next to Christ and John the Baptist, they were the most outstanding heroes this world has ever produced." And he goes on to say that in eternity we'll probably know all about what these guys did. But basically he says these guys were great heroes of the faith, even though we don't know any of the details. And he says we know they're great heroes of the faith because we know that they endured for a long time. Adam lived 930 years, and all he had to live on was this hope that God had given him when he left the garden, that I will bring redemption. There will be a son that will be born that will bring redemption, that will break the power of sin, death, and hell once and for all. And Adam lived for 930 years off that promise. As far as we know, that's the only promise that he had. That's the only hope that he had, was that promise that God gave to him right when he first got kicked out of the garden. And for 930 years, he hung in there. He endured. He had hope. Sometimes it's so hard for us. We get recharged sometimes on Sunday mornings, and we're given this hope, and we're given this kind of this new energy. It's so hard for us to make it till Tuesday, right? And Adam, for 930 years, he endured. Kenan, for 912 years, I think it was, he endured. He hung in there. Methuselah, for 969 years, he had this hope. He kept the faith. I'm not saying he never wavered. He probably had days where he woke up and he said, if this were true, God probably would have said something else in the last 1,000 years or so. But he hung in there. He didn't give in to that doubt. He endured. And so just that, we don't even really need to know what else they did. Just that in themselves makes them great godly heroes, because they endured. They hung in there. They kept the faith. Another guy by the name of Johannes Brents, he said, and I'm not going to quote what he said because basically it's way too long. He could have said it in about a third of the words that he actually used to say it. But basically he says that without these guys are important, because without these guys we don't get to Noah. And without Noah, we don't get to Jesus. We don't know much about their lives. They may have been, from an earthly perspective, they may have been very uninteresting and boring. But from the perspective of the kingdom, they are important for two reasons. One, they held out hope. They kept the faith. They endured. And number two is they were the one and only link between the promise in Genesis chapter 3 and that promise's fulfillment in Jesus Christ. They're the one and only link. You think back and look at this, okay? You go in verse 4, it says, the days of Adam, after he fathered Seth, were 800 years. He had other sons and daughters. Verse 5. Verse 6. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. So that time when Seth was born, between when Seth was born and that 105 years between when he was born and when he fathered Enosh, Seth was the one and only link between the promise in Genesis chapter 3 and the fulfillment in Jesus Christ. In verse 9, when Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. That 90 years between when Kenan was born and when Kenan had his son, right? For that 90 years, he's the one and only link between the promise in Genesis chapter 3 and the fulfillment in Jesus. What do we know about Enosh? What do we know about Kenan? We know that they lived. We know that they died. We know that they had families. Seems like they probably had a wife. We know they have kids. And we know that without them, we don't get to Jesus. The line is broken. The promise is broken. On some level, we know Kenan is the most important person to ever have lived. Because without him, there's no Jesus. I mean, I know God in his sovereignty, he would have found another way. But this is the way, this was the plan. God chose Kenan. God chose Jared. God chose Methuselah to bring his son into the world. And that makes them tremendously important. When I was in Bible college, one night we were sitting around having a silly discussion instead of studying or working on a paper that we should have been working on or something like that. And when we were talking about, that passage where James and John, they're wanting to sit one at Jesus' right hand and the other at Jesus' left hand. So rather than focusing in on the main point of that passage about how, it's not really important to focus in on what the rewards will be or what our status will be. The main point of that passage is to just do what you need to do and be the person you need to be and let God take care of all that stuff. Rather than focusing on the important point of that passage, we decided we'd try to figure out who was going to sit at God's right hand and who was going to sit at God's left hand, right? So we figured one of them would be an apostle. It's got to be an apostle, either Peter or Paul. So on God's right hand is either Peter or Paul. And on the left, we start naming out names because we figured God's not going to pick two apostles. He's going to probably pick somebody from another era. So we start throwing out names. Maybe it's Martin Luther or, it could be Billy Graham or George Washington or, we just start throwing out names. And one of the guys spoke up and he said, I think it's going to be somebody nobody's ever heard of before. Someone who did their job well, someone who loved their family, someone who loved Jesus. And maybe didn't do anything of note. Didn't start a mega church or reach a long-lost tribe in Africa. Didn't lead a nation or change the world in that sense. And I think he's right. I think we can get too caught up in celebrity. I think we can get too caught up in perceived importance. These guys in Genesis chapter 5, they didn't lead nations as far as we know. As far as we know, they didn't build a mega church. They didn't go and reach a long-lost tribe in the jungles of South America somewhere. But none of this works if we don't get to Jesus through them. If the line is broken in Genesis chapter 5, we don't get to Jesus. Again, like I said, God in His sovereignty can figure out another way. But this is the way that God chose to work His plan out. God chose to work His plan out through Kenan. God chose to work His plan out through Jared. And we don't know necessarily what these guys did. They may have not done anything noteworthy in their lives. But we know that the plan doesn't work quite the way God intended it to unless they fulfill God's purpose for their life. And I believe the same thing is true about every one of us. We serve a God who does everything He does with intent and with purpose. God doesn't create people by accident. God doesn't create people by mistake. And God doesn't create people without a plan. Everything that God does is pushing this story forward. Everything that God did in the book of Genesis, we've been talking about the book of Genesis as a story. Everything that happens in the book of Genesis is pushing the story forward. And I believe that God is the same today as He was in the book of Genesis. We are still living out this story. This is really just the first chapter of the story of humanity, and we are still living out the next chapters of this story. And everything that God is doing now is pushing this story forward. And that includes creating you. Everything that He does is important to the story. You will probably never lead a nation. You will probably never build a mega church or take the gospel to a long-lost tribe in South America. But you matter. Maybe nobody will ever quite know why you matter. Maybe you'll never figure out quite why you matter. But you matter. Because if you didn't matter, God wouldn't have created you. And I know this thing doesn't work out quite the same without you. Not because you're so wonderful. Not because you're so great and your skills are so amazing that we couldn't do it without you. But because you were created by God, you were created in the image of God. And everything that God does, He does with a purpose, He does with a reason, and He does it right. You were created by God, you were created in His image, and that is a big deal. Let's pray together.